For the small number of people who actually watched the Book of Boba Fett, you might vaguely recall that series turned Boba Fett into a side character on his own show. That same thing has now happened to Mando in his series as well. It's not uncommon for a long-running series to have entire episodes that are focused solely on one person who normally would not be considered a main character. This isn't a problem when a season has 20 episodes or more. But when Disney series have only 6 to 8 episodes, there simply isn't enough time for that. The result is that you have the supposed main character of the series, Mando, constantly being pushed aside in order to make room for other characters whose name the audience doesn't even know. The Mandalorian is bad, Episode 5. We open with Greef in a meeting talking about changes to the city, but this is interrupted by the arrival of the pirate ship from the previous episode. The pirate captain, Swamp Thing, contacts Greef, accusing him of killing his men in cold blood. Greef tries to argue that the planet is under the protection of the New Republic, but Swamp Thing calls his bluff. Before closing the communication, Swamp Thing says, "Don't hail me again unless you're prepared to surrender." Emphasis here, he says, "Don't hail me again unless you're prepared to surrender." This line of dialogue sounds very strange because it was in fact Swamp Thing who's the one who hailed Greef and not the other way around. While this might seem like a small oversight, a slip-up in the dialogue, it's actually indicative of a much bigger problem for not just this series, but everything that Disney creates, whether it's Marvel or Star Wars, if it's a TV show or a movie, it doesn't matter. This thing that's causing the problem is the plague of rewrites. While it's true that almost every single show and movie will have some small amount of rewrites that change a scene or some dialogue, Disney content does this to an extreme. An example of this was Doctor Strange 2, which underwent massive rewrites after all the filming had concluded. The studio then had to go back and film all of the changes, which made the whole thing take longer to create and also ballooned the cost of the project.
Can the Treasury bear such expense?
The same thing happens with the Disney Plus shows, where major story elements are given rewrites in between each episode, which often leads to an incoherent mess. This is very likely why Swamp Thing had his dialogue the way it was, telling Greef not to call him again. Very likely the original script had Greef as the one who called Swamp Thing, but then they changed the first part of the scene and forgot to change the second part.
Danny kind of forgot it.
Regardless, Swamp Thing begins attacking the city. Greef records a message asking for help and sends it out. On some other planet, we're once again met with the X-Wing pilot. We've seen him in previous seasons. I still have no idea what his name is, and I'm willing to bet that most of the people who watch this show don't know what his name is either.
Who are you again?
I considered giving him the nickname Miyagi, but let's face it, he's not even remotely cool enough for that, so I'm just gonna keep referring to him as the X-Wing pilot. After watching the distress message, he wants to help out because he believes that there's more going on with Planet Nevada than what the New Republic might think. He believes that these pirates might actually be connected to Moff Gideon and some sort of resurgence of the Empire. He wants to take a squadron to the planet Nevada, but in order to do so, he needs to request assistance from New Republic Command. For some bizarre reason, he can't simply send a message. Instead, he has to travel all the way to Coruscant himself.
Most illogical.
Even traveling through hyperspace, this would likely take days. However, the show makes it happen in only a few minutes, which is confirmed when we see Greef in the very next scene, as he is still responding to the initial attack on the city. It's contrived nonsense that the X-Wing pilot can't simply send a communication, and it's even more contrived nonsense that he's able to travel all the way to Coruscant in a matter of minutes. Yes, hyperspace travel is faster than light, but it still takes a good amount of time to go from one system to another. It's not instantaneous like this show would like you to believe.
That's not how the Force works.
But don't worry, it gets worse. The person that he meets is a colonel who's in charge of requisitions. This is bizarre to say the least, because an officer in charge of requisitions would be responsible for providing physical equipment and resources. He would not be in charge of squadrons that provide security or other combat-related activity. To put it simply, you would need to see the requisitions officer in order to replace equipment that has been destroyed, like a ship, for example. However, if you needed that ship and its pilot to go destroy something, you would speak to the squadron commander. They are two separate jobs, not even remotely the same.
So it would seem.
But it gets even dumber, because when the X-Wing pilot says that he needs to bring the squadron to planet Nevada, the requisitions officer says that he's never heard of it.
What good are you? Do you have a brain?
I would remind you that one of the most significant battles involving Old Empire forces, which also included one of the highest-ranking Old Empire officers still alive, namely Moff Gideon, just occurred on planet Nevada. The idea that this high-ranking officer in the New Republic would be completely unaware even of the existence of planet Nevada is fucking absurd. This colonel wouldn't even need to be involved in some sort of high-level New Republic briefing in order to get this information. The people that were on the planet at the time would absolutely have spread that throughout the galaxy. It would be on every single news feed throughout the entire New Republic, talking about the battle that took place with Old Empire forces on planet Nevada. Again, the idea that this colonel doesn't even know about it is absurd. And making things worse, unfortunately, we're once again met with the Femles, who enters the colonel's office, and he asks her if she's ever heard of planet Nevada, and she says that yes, she has, and she points out that the planet has not properly signed the agreements with the New Republic, and therefore is not legally under their protection, and that the New Republic can't do anything to help them. The colonel therefore refuses to provide any assistance to the X-Wing pilot, and he leaves.
You lose! Good day, sir!
Back on Nevada, Greef is addressing a group of people. They manage to walk several miles away from the city. He reassures them that he has sent out messages and that help will be arriving soon. However, I find it kind of hilarious that there are only about 40 people in this group, despite the fact that the city is home to thousands of people. I realize that not everyone would escape in the same direction, but it is incomprehensible that this group only consists of 40 people. Where is everybody else? As we'll see later in the episode, there are a few that have stayed behind in the city, but that still doesn't account for the literal thousands of people that are missing. Even if Disney didn't want to utilize a few hundred extras in order to make these scenes more realistic, why didn't they just use CGI to fill in the gaps? Because we all know Disney loves using their CGI. They're more than willing to spend thousands of dollars to create glowing CGI ice cream from a previous episode. You're telling me that they can't take the time to inflate the size of this crowd just a little bit? Really? Is that where their use of CGI ends? But don't worry, it gets worse. The X-Wing pilot has now arrived at the secret cave base of the Mandalorians, and this seems a bit strange, though I initially thought, hey, maybe he got in touch with Mando, who told him the location, except that's not what happened. A few moments later, it's revealed that the X-Wing pilot was able to find this location because he had been in communication with R5, the astromech droid that Mando has been using.
That's just lazy writing.
The writers are desperately trying to use this loose connection to hand-wave away how the X-Wing pilot could have gotten here, but it's completely ridiculous. How exactly would the X-Wing pilot communicate with R5 to begin with? In order for that to happen, the pilot would have had to send a communication in the general vicinity of where the droid would be to receive it. Are the writers trying to suggest that the X-Wing pilot could broadcast a signal in the open that would be strong enough for a single astromech droid halfway across the galaxy to pick it up? In a previous episode, we saw that a fucking cave was able to block communications. How is it exactly that this pilot could broadcast that signal to reach R5 on the other side of the galaxy, who, by the way, happened to be in the cave? And even if by some very remote chance that this was able to happen, how exactly was R5 supposed to reply? The droid would have had to get inside Mando's ship in order to send the communication, and it seems rather unlikely that this would happen without Mando noticing it. This entire situation is fucking ridiculous. However, what's truly pathetic about this scene is the reaction of the Mandalorians. The X-Wing pilot is unarmed and holding his arms out, Yet the Mandalorians are acting like scaredy cats. These are supposed to be battle-hardened warriors, and yet they flinch and startle with every little movement that the X-Wing pilot makes.
Go ahead, skin it. Skin that smoke wagon and see what happens.
The pilot gives Mando the message that he got from Greef, and then he leaves. But I have to ask, why? The X-Wing pilot's goal was to get the Mandalorians' help to planet Nevada, and at the moment he's unsure if they're going to help out or not. So why would the X-Wing pilot leave right now? Shouldn't he wait around to see if the Mandalorians are going to help, and then he would go with them? The pilot has no idea if the Mandalorians are even going to help, but he decides to leave the planet and he never travels to Nevada himself. So the pilot is just kind of hoping that the Mandalorians will do the job of rescuing Greef and all those people for him. What if the Mandalorians had decided not to help? The pilot isn't going to do anything else? He's not going to go and seek out another group of people? He's not going to have any other connections that he could possibly ask? Like, hey, there's a whole bunch of people in danger from these pirates and they could definitely use your help. He doesn't have any plan. There's nothing else that he's going to do. He's not even going to go there himself to try to do something. No, he doesn't. Instead, he puts all of his faith in the Mandalorians and just kind of hopes that they're going to come to the right decision and that they're going to go and help the people on planet Nevada.
Not a great plan.
But don't worry, it gets worse. Inside the cave, the Mandalorians are discussing what they should do. Mando makes the plea that they should go and help Greef, that even though they may have been enemies at one point, he says that Greef was crucial in saving the life of the foundling Goku, and he has also helped out the Mandalorians in the past as well. But then Blueberry steps up, and now it's his turn to talk about what they should do, and he starts out by saying the Mandalorians had to fight Greef in the past, and he was an enemy, and he begins talking as if the Mandalorians should refuse to help, but then suddenly there's a big twist, and he says, who cares if we had to fight Greef in the past? We're Mandalorians, and fighting is what we do. The writers were trying to set up this scene so that Blueberry at first would appear as if he was going to oppose Mando's idea, but it was so lazily and obviously done that everyone could see this quote-unquote twist coming from a mile away. Also, don't forget in the previous episode, Blueberry stopped just short of swearing a life debt to Mando for helping to rescue his son, so the fake opposition that Blueberry starts to give is just idiotic.
It is a tale told by an idiot.
Mando also says that Greef offered him a large plot of land on planet Nevada, and rather than going into hiding at another location, the Mandalorians could claim that piece of land and set up a proper home. All of the Mandalorians agree to this, and they begin loading into the ship. Back on planet Nevada, we see that the pirates have been destroying some of the buildings and causing problems for the people who stayed behind. We also see that the pirate ship is hovering above the city. This ship is gigantic. It may not be as big as an Imperial destroyer, but it is still a massively large ship. We know that ships this large or bigger can land on a planet and then take off back into space, and we know that very large ships are also capable of hovering above the surface. It did make sense for this pirate ship to hover above the city in atmosphere during the initial attack, but what we're seeing right now is taking place several days or possibly a week later. It would require an astronomical amount of fuel to keep a ship this large hovering above the city for that long of a period. Furthermore, there is no need for the ship to be hovering above the city because any possible threat is not going to appear from below, but instead a new threat would arrive from space, which is why it makes it all the more bizarre that the pirate captain would be keeping his ship hovering above the city instead of in orbit around the planet.
I barely have a reason to care, and even I noticed.
However, the following scene needs the pirate ship to be hovering above the city because that's where the writers want the upcoming battle to happen. So even though it doesn't make any fucking sense whatsoever, the pirate ship needs to be there.
The buffoonery is endless.
Regardless, a few moments later, the Mandalorians arrive. The plan is for Mando to act as a decoy, so all of the small fighter craft will chase after him. Meanwhile, the rest of the Mandalorians will land in the city to fight the pirates. Mando and Bo-Katan use their ships to destroy the pirate fighters, and eventually they destroy the pirate carrier ship as well. I can't help but think that perhaps, just perhaps, having an additional X-Wing would have been beneficial here, but you know, I guess this motherfucker just had other things to do.
It's not your fault you're chronic two-faced liars.
As for the fighting in the city, there's a bunch of it, but it's all pretty boring. Grief brings his small group of people back to the city where they help capture the remainder of the pirates. Once again, I need to point out that the city is supposed to have thousands of people, and yet we only ever see about 30 or 40 of them, so I don't know where the other ones went. Grief thanks the Mandalorians and welcomes them back to Nevada. He also offers them the land that was promised to Mando and says the Mandalorians now have a permanent home. However, there's still several minutes left in the episode, and it's about to get extremely stupid. Okay, it's about to get more stupid than it already was. The armorer goes back to the forge that she had used in previous seasons and asks Bo-Katan to go with her. Once there, the armorer talks about requiring the unification of all Mandalorians, and then she orders Bo-Katan to remove her helmet.
I'm sorry. What?
Now, I've pointed out in the past that this whole helmet removing thing is a bunch of bullshit that was created specifically for this show and that it has never existed in Mandalorian lore beforehand. However, if you're going to establish this stupid new stuff, it is important that the writers remain consistent, and what we know about this creed is that the Mandalorians are never allowed to take off their helmet in the presence of another person. There is no exception to this rule. It is absolutely, unequivocally forbidden for Mandalorians to do this. Mando was treated as an outcast, despite the fact that his actions were necessary to save the life of a foundling. It didn't matter, removing his helmet was still forbidden. So Bo-Katan seems hesitant, and then the armorer says, "Do you respect the authority of my station?"
Respect my authority!
Once more, the armorer commands Bo-Katan to remove her helmet. While the armorer is not an official leader among this group, she does have a somewhat higher status, though even still, it wouldn't matter. The creed says that Mandalorians are absolutely forbidden from removing their helmets. It is likely that even Mandalore himself would not have the proper authority to command someone to remove their helmet under the rules of this creed. So this entire situation is ridiculous. It breaks the rules that the writers themselves have tried to establish with their own bullshit creed in this stupid show.
Oh, I don't know. You managed to destroy just about everything today. The villains, the heroes.
But don't worry, it gets worse. The armorer then claims that Bo-Katan is capable of walking in both worlds, meaning that she can work with the Mandalorians who follow the stupid helmet creed thing, and she can also work with the other Mandalorians who don't. The armor implies that Bo-Katan can remove her helmet as often as she wants and still be considered someone who is following the creed. And this doesn't make any fucking sense whatsoever. What's even more ridiculous is that when Bo-Katan is seen without her helmet by the other Mandalorians, she is not immediately shunned like Mando was. Instead, they instantly accept the armorer's bizarre conflicting philosophy that Bo-Katan is one of them even when she chooses to remove her helmet.
Logic is an integral part of narrative structure.
The armorer tells Bo-Katan and Mando to leave Nevada to go in search of the other Mandalorians, but we're not done with the stupidity yet. The final scene shows the X-Wing pilot who's discovered the shuttlecraft that was transporting Moff Gideon. He investigates the ship to find that much of the crew is dead and Moff Gideon is missing. He also notices some extra metal that has been melted onto the side of the shuttle. He scans it and discovers that it's Beskar alloy. This, of course, leaves the X-Wing pilot to come to the conclusion that the Mandalorians were the ones who attacked the shuttle. In this show full of absurd nonsense, this rises to a new level.
I expect nothing, and I'm still let down.
I would very much like for one of the writers to please explain to me how this melted Beskar managed to get inside the shuttlecraft and somehow attached to one of the walls. The Mandalorians, for the most part, only use Beskar as their armor. Exactly how does a big chunk of melted Beskar get stuck to the wall? It couldn't be from a blaster, because we've seen time and time again that blasters just bounce off of Beskar steel. So it's not possible that the Beskar was melted from blasters. Perhaps it could have been something more significant, like a thermal detonator, and that could have melted some of the Beskar onto the wall. But again, explain how that would be possible. See, here's the problem. If a thermal detonator had gone off close enough to the Mandalorian to melt some of the Beskar steel, then the wall itself wouldn't exist. There is no possible logical explanation for how a large smear of melted Beskar alloy could have ever possibly ended up on the inside of the wall of this shuttlecraft. This is some of the laziest plot contrivance I have ever seen. And if you think that's bad, it's about to get much, much worse. But thankfully, that's the end of episode 5.
I'm taking shots at the enemy. I'm gonna make it to the top, leave a legacy. If I got something to say, you better let me speak. Turn it up a new degree, bitch, you ain't seen anything. I pop off with the new rock, electronic